Hey, so I want to look at how Alistair McGrath talks about faith in this chapter and some of the deeply related components to faith. Now, he begins by looking at the opening line in most of the creeds in Christianity, which essentially say, I believe or we believe. Now, he doesn't really talk much about the word belief. He talks more about faith, because faith is definitely a component of belief. But if you read on those first couple of pages, he talks about faith. He defines faith more as trust. That faith is an inherent trust that the believer has. Now, please know that and he addresses this later on, but please know that he's not saying that faith is simply like a blind, it doesn't make sense to me, I don't have evidence for it, I'm just going to believe it. He's not saying that at all. Faith is a deep trust for Alistair McGrath, for the Christian tradition, in God, in God's purposes. And so hold this idea of trust with you as we go throughout the semester. Because initially you might be thinking, well, what does it mean to trust God? Well, who is God? Well, that's going to be an essential question once we get there. But let's look at this quote that he addresses early on in the chapter. This is by a man named W.K. Clifford, who says, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." And look at that phrase. When I look at that, I often find myself saying, I believe a lot of things based on insufficient evidence. And you do too. I'm not an expert in tons of things. I don't have all of the evidence in front of me. And so therefore I believe things based on insufficient evidence. So what question, this is kind of where I want to go. What question does this quote raise? Okay, what question does this quote, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence"? The question that I really think it raises is this: by what criterion does one count evidence as sufficient? You and I can look at data, or you and I can have experiences, and we can deem those experiences or those types of evidence either as sufficient, more sufficient, less sufficient, insufficient than others. So the question is going to be, by what criterion, you might need to look that up if that doesn't make sense to you, by what criterion does one count evidence as sufficient? Okay, that's going to be pushing us as we go along. So we're going to need to now talk about ontology, because the question is going to be, well, can we prove the existence of God? So ontology is the philosophical study of being, B-E-I-N-G. And you'll know that if you've read the chapter, McGrath does a really good job of arguing this. Can we prove the existence of God? By academic argument, by reason. Now, there were some people throughout Christian history that thought, yes, we can. And so, therefore, we have what is known as the ontological argument. St. Thomas Aquinas, his was in the 13th century, which is one of the most well-known ontological arguments. And I just want to make you a little bit more familiar with this. So St. Thomas Aquinas, he has a very well-written and somewhat difficult to understand ontological argument, but it includes a couple of things that we need to look at. Number one, it includes a cosmological argument. This is an argument from observation. I can look at the cosmos and I can deduce, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, the existence of God by observation. I'll unpack this one in just a second. There's a second one, which is known as the teleological argument. Now this, for Aquinas, is an argument from design. So let's try to address this question. What is teleology? You might need to look that up. A telos is a goal. It's a goal that I am going to work towards. So whenever I think of this, I've always thought of an acorn. What is the goal of an acorn? Well, the goal of an acorn is to flourish and to become an oak tree. Okay? So the telos, the teleological end for an acorn, is to become an oak tree and live for several hundred years. So this is going to be an argument from design. So let's look at the first one, the argument from observation. Aquinas' argument here is, again, trying to prove the existence of God by reason, is that everything in the universe depends on something else for its existence. I'm looking out this window right now and I can see trees, I can see grass, I can even see this building. And I know that those trees are there because of pollen from other trees. I can look at my dog. I can look at myself, and I know that everything that exists now exists or depends upon something else for its existence. Okay, you and me depend on our parents for our existence. That tree depends on pollinated. My biology is bad here, so forgive me. The building here that I'm sitting in depends on somebody else for making it. So notice what he says here. What is true of the individual is also true of the universe itself. So what's true about you and me, what is true about these trees out here, is true about the larger universe. In other words, the universe did not, according to Aquinas, create itself. Now notice, he's writing this in the 12th and 13th century. You know, the height of the Middle Ages, the height of what is known as scholasticism and Christianity. And so therefore he says, number 3, that the universe depends on something else for its existence. So the best way I think of this is the cosmological argument is a lot like a whole bunch of dominoes. We needed somebody, or like all of these were set up by somebody, but we needed somebody to push that first domino. In other words, go back to what he was saying here. What is true of the individual parts is also true of the universe itself, because everything in the universe depends on something else for its existence. And therefore, for Aquinas, we can now prove that God exists because the universe itself depends on something else for its existence. And Aquinas calls that God. Okay, so Aquinas is working here off of the great philosopher Aristotle, one of the great world philosophers of the last 3,000 years. And his idea was that the God is what is known as the unmoved mover. That there was no movement to God. God was the one who moved. God was the one who pushed this domino way back here. And therefore God is the unmoved mover. And so this is known as the cosmological argument. Again, it's an argument from observation, looking at the universe itself. The next one is the teleological argument. Now, this is a little bit more nuanced. So it's a little bit different, but I think it's equally compelling sometimes. So natural processes and objects seem to be adapted with a certain definite objective in mind. So I'm recording this a month before my wife is going to give birth. And watching this whole process of her being pregnant is in a sense kind of the teleological argument. So think, if you will, with me of two cells, the zygotes, the sperm and the egg. Those two cells, when they join together, you basically have the ultimate stem cell. You have you have those cells, and then those cells start to divide, and then they start to divide, and then you have the blastocyte and all of these other things I'm trying to remember from biology. But as the fetus continues to develop, what's so interesting is some of those cells are designed to make osteocytes or osteoblasts, bone cells. Some of those cells are essentially designed, Aquinas would say, to make smooth muscle cells. Others are made to make cardiac muscle cells. Others, skeleton muscle cells. Others, neurons. In other words, it's fascinating looking at the development of a fetus and then the development of a child, because those cells seemed to have an objective in mind, to be an ear, to make heart muscle. things, according therefore to Aquinas, don't just design themselves. They must be caused or designed by something else. In other words, they all have a goal in mind. And this is what is known as the teleological argument. The goal, like I said earlier, of the acorn is to become an oak tree. And because he says here that things are caused and designed by something else, he wants to argue that, therefore, God exists. God is the ultimate designer, the ultimate causer. An example of the teleological argument is seen in the chapter by the philosopher, the man named William Paley, who, legend has it, was walking along the beach one day. He saw a watch, and he looked down, and he deduced, if there's a watch, there must be a watchmaker. Okay, if there's a watch, there must be a watchmaker. And therefore, if there's a universe, if there's a you and a me and a computer and cell phones, if there's all of this stuff, there must be a stuff maker, and that is what we call God. So let's go back to that question that we asked earlier. Can we prove the existence of God? What conclusion does Alister McGrath come to? Well, I hope that you picked up that he says we cannot prove the existence of God. And then you also need to pick up on the very, very key thing, nor can we disprove God's existence. Okay, we cannot prove the existence of God, nor can we disprove the existence of God. And therefore, he says, one needs faith. So there are other ontological arguments out here. Anselm, I really like his. We're not going to concern ourselves with that right now. But please read in the book some of the arguments of the great Pope John Paul II, who was the Pope of my childhood, basically. And then also of the gentleman named John Polkinghorne. He is a physicist. And in his study of physics, that led him to a belief in God, and now he's also an ordained priest in the Church of England. So throughout the chapter, he's talking about these proofs for the existence of God. But please remember that we cannot prove nor can we disprove the existence of God. But whenever we come here to Pope John Paul II, look at how he addresses this. For Pope John Paul II, and I think that he's right here, faith is, according to the late Pope, beyond reason, but it is not contrary to reason. You will probably find yourself in this class thinking, we can't know that. And we probably can't. When it comes to, the Christian definition of God, or even the Muslim or the Jewish, the Hindu definition of God, we fully cannot know. But that does not mean that it is beyond reason. He goes on in this chapter to talk about faith as blind trust. Here, I'm reading in the second edition on page 8. He's talking about the letter that Pope John Paul II wrote. He says, the letter stresses that faith is not blind trust, opposed to the evidence of the world. Rather, it points out that the world, which Christians see as God's creation, is studded with hints of God's existence and nature. And so, therefore, we go back to this theme that faith is beyond reason, but it is not contrary to reason. Okay, faith is not this blind trust. And we're going to unpack that as we go along. So, how does Martin Luther talk about faith? Martin Luther talks about faith. He defines it in a little bit more of a personal phrase here. He says three things. That faith has a personal rather than a purely historical reference. When the creeds say, I believe, for Martin Luther, it really unpacks this deeply personal faith, okay, this personal trust. So faith for Martin Luther, the second point, deals with trusting in the promises of God. Now, here, I want to kind of delineate this argument a little bit. Now, the promises of God are not that I will always be healthy. The promises of God in the Christian scriptures are not that I will always be rich, that I will always have a very easy life. We look at our world, we look at the Bible even, and we know that those aren't the promises that God has made. The promises that God has made, and we'll unpack this later on in the class, are more about relationship, are more about care, are more about love. The promises of God are not in the materialistic world that you and I live in, but it's in the spiritual world. It's in the deep, real meaning of the world. So for Martin Luther, faith is trusting in the promises of God, that God is always going to be with me, that when bad things happen, that God is there. When good things happen, that God is there. God is present. God is working. And so for Martin Luther, faith is trusting in the promises of God. And then therefore, and this kind of is the natural third point here, is that faith therefore unites the believer to Christ. What unites the Christian to their Savior is faith, is this relationship. It's this inherent trust in the promises of God. And so he concludes this chapter by looking at one of the big challenges to faith. And that is, as you and I well know, doubt, or is doubt. And we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about one more thing. Is faith contrary to doubt? Think about that. Is faith contrary to doubt? Or is doubt contrary to faith? So the tradition argues throughout Christianity, in the history of the tradition, we have several different sides of this argument. Now, some people, as I say here, say we don't need doubt. We don't need reason. Doubt is a bad thing. You just need to simply believe. Now, I can't tell you how many sermons I heard growing up which essentially said, we need to pray for you if you are having doubts. Because doubt, in the tradition that I was raised, is inherently bad. I was even told by members of my church, you should not study religion academically because that will make you doubt. You just need to simply believe. Now, for these people, doubt, yes, for them is very contrary to faith. Now, there are others in the tradition, though, that say, no, what doubt does is it leads to a humble approach to learning, to growth, to exploration, to really unpacking and learning what it is that Christians have said about the past, and then what the believer actually believes. So which side do you end up on more? Are you more of the, I just need to just kind of shut up and believe, or I need to explore my doubts a little bit? Now, let me speak personally here for a second. I'm very thankful that I was able to explore my doubts in academic settings with very caring people. I studied religion in college, and I had great professors that pushed me to the point where I was crying on my dorm room floor because I was really questioning what I believed. But they also did it in a very academic and a very loving way. When I was in grad school, too, a very intellectual enterprise. And yet I had very loving people around me. Sometimes I think we let our doubt just run amok without exploring it, without learning it. And so we also talk about that in a later section of the class as well. So when you do have doubts, I would really encourage you to find people, to find theologians, to find your parents, ministers, people in the academy, to help you think through some of these issues, because some of these issues are the questions that humanity has been wrestling for the last few thousand years. And it's really important, I believe, to get our minds around them. So what is the relationship between faith and doubt? Does doubt really call into question your faith, or does doubt push your faith on? And then the final thing, theodicy, evil. Theodicy is the word theologians use to talk about the problem of evil. And here, there's a lot going on, because if you look at the world today, I think that you will agree with me that evil exists. We lock our doors on our houses. We wouldn't want to live in certain parts of the world because of the evil that takes place there. Now, how does evil make sense in polytheism? Well, in some forms of polytheism, evil exists because there's a bad god. There's a god of destruction. There's a god of violence. There's a god of something that is causing the evil. We're going to talk about Platonism, going back to the philosophy of Plato a little bit later on, so I'm going to skip over that. But some people say, in order to try to understand evil in monotheism, that God is the source of evil. Now, notice, please, I am not saying this. Okay, I am not, and forgive me here, I am not saying, I'm trying to find a little drawer, that God is the source of evil. This is what some people say. And listen to how our society speaks at funerals. When they are at a funeral, a personal story. I was at a funeral of a 7th grade boy, loved over in Dallas, when I was working at Highland Park Methodist. Such a cool kid, died of a heart defect that he had. And at his funeral, one of the men eulogizing him said that God needed Lucas in heaven. That God took Lucas from us. In other words, God was the source of his death. And then 2 days later on Sunday, every minister at that Methodist church came out there and said, we do not believe that God kills people. We don't believe that God takes people away. But God is the source for some people, please hear I'm saying some people. I'm getting so emphatic that I choke on it. God is the source of evil for some people. When 9/11 happened, I remember so many people were asking, why did God do this? Now, other people, whenever they talk about evil and monotheism, they talk about the truth that God created creation to create. Okay? People, animals, plants, life has the freedom to create. I can create beauty with art, with poetry, with paintings. My paintings aren't beautiful. I can create also beauty, wholeness, restoration in communities, in my community involvement. I can also personally, me, David, can create evil. And so some people in monotheistic circles say that God is the source. Other people in monotheistic circles say, no, God is not the source, but God created things that have the freedom to create evil. And so here we look at, again, another philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, who's still alive, who's talking about evil. He's trying to understand why is it that evil exists. And he says, free will is morally important. That's supposed to be is, not in. Free will is morally important. So if human beings were forced to do nothing but good, okay, if God forced human beings to do nothing but good, according to the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, that would represent a denial of human free will. And so therefore, God must bring into being the best possible world that he is able to bring, which includes the fact that God is not going to force human beings to always do good because we have free will. And therefore, it must follow that God must create a world with free will. And this, according to Plantinga, means that God is not responsible for human beings' choice to do when human beings choose to do evil. God is operating under the self-imposed constraints that means he will not compel human beings to do good. So this is one of the ways in which the philosopher Alvin Plantinga is trying to understand evil. How are we best to understand evil and its relationship with God? Now notice for Plantinga, God is not the source of evil. God is the source of bringing out the best possible world, which includes the reality of human free will. With human free will, we do have the possibility of evil. And then finally, please pay special attention at the end of your chapter to the theologian named Jürgen Moltmann, and then also the great thinker and theologian with whom we talk about later on, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Jürgen Moltmann, in trying to talk about evil, really reacts against the idea that God is the cause. Jürgen Moltmann says, no, God is not the cause of evil. I was reading Moltmann in college when 9/11 happened. And it was so interesting because so many of the questions that were swirling around in the American ethos were, why did God do this? Or where is God in all of this? Where is God in evil? Where is God in suffering? And I was reading a book by Jürgen Moltmann at that time called The Crucified God. And Moltmann, one of the great modern thinkers of Christian theology, his argument is that, and you'll read more about him later on, his argument is that the suffering that Christ experienced on the cross and the suffering that God experienced, the Father, in seeing his Son die, radically transformed the heart of God in the sense that now God is one who has experienced the deepest experience of life, which is death. And for Jürgen Moltmann, the suffering that Christ experienced on the cross and the suffering that the Father experienced in the death of his Son radically transforms the truth of Christian theology, that God is not the cause of suffering, but rather God is the divine sufferer. God is the one who suffers with God's creation. He goes and read that section of this chapter, please. Here I'm reading in the second edition on page 16. In this response, why I don't believe in God. Some people so oftentimes think that God is the cause of suffering. Why did God give me cancer? Why did God take my grandmother? Why did God allow this car accident? And what is Moltmann's response? Moltmann's response is that God chooses to share in the sufferings of the world. Far from being indifferent, God shows his commitment and compassion by entering into this veil of soul-making, of bearing its sorrow and pain. At the end of the chapter, he talks about a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Please look up Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a very interesting theologian of the 20th century, who was killed by the Nazi regime for his attempt to assassinate Hitler. For Bonhoeffer, again, picking up on this idea that God is not the cause of evil, but God is one who suffers, he says, a suffering God, according to Bonhoeffer, is not one who abandons God's people. Far from it. He stands by them as a fellow sufferer and bring them home to a place from which suffering and pain have been removed. Now think, both of these theologians have lived. Bonhoeffer, he dealt uniquely with the World War II, and Jürgen Moltmann lived, he's a German theologian, during World War II. And their response to World War II, one of the great evils of history, is that God is not the cause. World War II ought not cause people to lose their faith, but rather it should strengthen their faith in the reality and the Christian truth that God is one who suffers with God's people. And so therefore, in the Christian tradition, faith is best understood as the word trust. Trust in the promises of God, trust in the reality of God, trust in the love of God, and trust in the truth that God is one right here, who has not abandoned his people, but stands with them as a fellow sufferer. God is one who suffers with God's creation, and therefore faith in Christian theology is trusting in the work and the promises of God.